Stay curious, stay calm. The river breathes low and metallic before dawn. You wake to the city breathing through ropes and timbers, the soft slap of tide against the quay, a gull's thin complaint, the distant hammer of a cooper shaping a barrel. For a moment, you are only a body stepping into light, filtered through a low, gray Liverpool sky. Salt rides the air, and the faint soot from the chimneys dusts your lip. In the counting house, the merchant's morning is both private ritual and public work. He moves toward a table where ink, quills, and a small teapot sit together. A maid has already laid a plain slice of bread in a cup. Household accounts from the period commonly list tea, bread, butter, and sometimes salted fish or cold meat. Simple fare that reads as economy, but also habit. The breakfast is eaten amid business, an open ledger, a folded shipping notice, columns of freight and terse notations of cargo. Outside, the docks throng with business. A brig's rigging squeals, men shout along the quay. The air carries molasses from barges and the metallic tang of newly hauled iron. Beneath these wafts is another odor, one that appears in many period records, the cramped, sour smell of human confinement when people were held aboard ships prior to the Middle Passage. Liverpool, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, had become a major hub in the triangular trade, and those realities threaded the city's streets and rooms. The merchant lifts his cup with an economy of gesture. He reads the day's incoming letters, an underwriter's note from a coffee house, an account from a factor in the Caribbean, a captain's estimate of readiness. Marine insurance shaped decisions as much as timber or canvas. Premiums signed in private rooms could halt a voyage or send it westward. Reports of privateers, outbreaks of sickness at certain ports, and seasonal currents all altered the calculus. Those market movements are as present at breakfast as the steam from the teapot. Conversation at the table is pragmatic. A clerk reads aloud a manifest entry, 132 souls, a phrase that appears in contemporary documents. On paper it is a number. In practice it denotes people. Merchants recorded such totals in ledgers. Ship surgeons later recorded mortality in returns and journals. These documents are the raw traces historians use to reconstruct the scale and rhythms of voyages, cold figures that point to human stories, and traces that abolitionists and officials would later gather into argument. Domestic display matters here. The merchant's house often sits just back from the quay, a counting house at the front, parlors behind, and a family room where charitable gifts would be planned. Public benefactions, funded schools, hospital wings, stained glass donations were common among merchants who wished to secure standing. Yet the money for such gifts frequently traces to the same pages that list cargoes from colonial fields and African coasts. That contradiction, public virtue balanced against private commerce, sits uncomfortably under every morning's tea. At breakfast, practical anxieties surface. A clerk notes an increase in the insurance premium. Privateer reports off the Irish coast. A cargo line shows delay in Barbados. The merchant checks a wall map, an engraved chart of familiar currents, and weighs options. Charter a faster schooner, wait for a convoy, or negotiate coverage with underwriters. Each choice shifts ledgers and reputations. Each ripple will affect captains, crews, and those held in distant pens. There is also small, ordinary life. A child's shoes patter at the doorway. A woman passing brings news of a market price. A dockhand hoists a cask and jokes, the sound bright among the math of trade. Clothing marks status, broadcloth coats, neat waistcoats, gloves folded by the ledger, and objects mark purpose. A globe on a side table, an engraving of the African coast pinned behind a bookcase, perhaps a small model ship kept under glass. These things signal a man who brokers distance. They also stage the counting house as a place where private appetite and public commerce meet. Manifests, surgeon returns, insurance policies, dry, precise records kept in rooms like this, later became primary evidence in public debates. First-person narratives and printed depositions added the voices numbers could not supply. For now, in the gray light before departure, the counting house holds both calculation and an unspoken moral question. The merchant can note the figures, close the ledger, and step toward the quay, but the documents he tends already point beyond the table, toward other coasts and other bodies. He finishes his tea. A bell calls from the quay. The clerk folds the manifest and seals it with wax. A valet fetches the merchant's hat. The day that began with routine and steam will bend toward rigging and rope. The voyage that those breakfast papers will help fund waits already beyond the quay's edge. Light in the counting house comes in chapters, the first gray wash through high windows, the thin glare across a brass inkstand, the way paper looks different when the day tightens. By the time the merchant crosses the threshold, the room has gathered its small histories, rings of tea on a blotter, a pressed receipt from an earlier voyage, a hand-scrawled note about a cargo of rum. The quills lie ready. The ledgers open like long secret maps. Clerks move like instruments tuned to the day's measure. They sort bills of lading, compare weights, and mark payments that will ripple to partners in London and plantations beyond. Their fingers are calloused where they turn pages. Their noses know the 2 or 3 smells that live in the counting room: old paper, lamp oil, and the faint, persistent sugar tang carried from the quay. A young clerk reads aloud an entry, and the merchant listens with the slow attention of someone who reads profit and danger. Records arrive in packets, letters folded into wax, surgeons' returns, manifests, and sometimes a thin sheet noting deaths at sea. Surgeons' journals, an ordinary source on voyages, list causes and rates of mortality, and these documents govern how merchants judge risk. A margin note can change an estimate. A bracketed name can mean another partner has withdrawn. Every mark matters. The counting house is also a place of translation. Emotions are translated into columns. Human stories become debits and credits. The merchant who presides over the room practices a kind of linguistic cool. He will say loss, shortage, mortality, as if they were terms in a language removed from their fullest meanings. Yet his hands betray him, tremble slightly over a page, hesitate on a name. The ledger keeps him honest. The ledger does not keep him humane. Outside, the city's light sharpens, and the quay grows noisier. Men arrive with ropes and tar. A cask is rolled past the counting house door. Children laugh and dart between the feet of sailors. Inside, the merchant reads a surgeon's summary aloud. Fever in the pens at a coastal depot is not uncommon, the note says. Some captains refuse certain districts in high season. The young clerk looks up. There is a small argument over whether to press onward or to delay until the underwriters offer a fair rate. Coffee houses and exchange rooms hold the sound of commerce in another octave. Underwriters assemble in places where gossip becomes policy. Captains stop for news. Though Liverpool did not have the single dominant exchange like London's Lloyd's, its local coffee houses and exchange rooms functioned as sites where risk was shared and priced. The decision to sail did not rest only on the counting house table. It moved through a network of men and rooms whose conversations hardened into signatures. A merchant's reputation is a fragile currency. A history of voyages that return with low loss invites investment. A disastrous season can withdraw credit and close doors. Men speak of bad bills and hard winters, with the same voice used to describe misfortunes on distant plantations. Yet reputation is also bound to gestures of public generosity, donations to hospitals or schools, which smooth awkward reckonings at home. The counting house is where the balance between these reputational demands is constantly recalibrated. Within the room, private habits persist. A woman's muffled voice upstairs asks for alms. A footman places a parcel of oysters on the sideboard. The local diet mixes the city's sea with its commerce. The merchant glances at a portrait over the mantel, an ancestor in ruff and lace who looks down with the solemnity of civic virtue. That ancestral gaze is a performance. It links a family to the civic life of the port, while eliding the hands that made the money. The clerks bring forward the day's urgent papers. One is a customs notice. An inspection is due before clearance can be granted. Another is a short sealed note from a factor in the islands reporting delays in harvests and asking for additional credit. The merchant starts to calculate. If sugar prices drop, which consignments can be delayed? Which bills will be called? He taps a pencil along the margin. His breathing slows and quickens by turns. The counting house hums like a living ledger. There is quiet tension over the crew's readiness. Captains sometimes delay to recruit able seamen. Sometimes they are forced to set off with smaller crews, exposing the voyage to strain. There is also the thin, moral arithmetic no ledger can fully measure. Men in chains boarded in ports out of view from these rooms, and were held in confined spaces until the ship was seaworthy. For the merchant, those human presences are items in a manifest. For the men and women themselves, the counting house motions determine fates ashore and at sea. A bell from the quay marks the hour, an instrument that once sounded for many purposes, now folded into the rhythm of commerce. It stops the young clerk mid-sentence. A shadow passes the counting house door, a customs officer uniformed with a list and an ineffable air of authority. He lays down a small official stamp that requires the merchant's signature. The document is routine but consequential. Inspections can delay departure for days. A single hold on clearance can cascade into demurrage costs and reputational damage. The merchant studies the stamp. He knows the calculus. Docks pay demurrage as a standard cost of trade, but prolonged delay suggests bad weather, bad health ashore, or political unease, all facts that push underwriters to higher premiums. He feels the ledger's weight as if it were a stone on his chest. He reaches for his pen. Outside, the tide shifts and the cranes begin their slow, iron pulse. Then, as the pen lifts, a portman enters with a sealed packet. The merchant recognizes the folded wax, the hand of an island factor or a surgeon. The little room leans closer. Even the air seems to hold its breath. He breaks the wax. The words inside are brief, but their implication brightens and sharpens the air in a way the counting house light never has. The manifest is spread on the table like a small, terrible oracle, a folded sheet with neat columns and a cashier's marginal notes. It smells faintly of salt and lamp oil. When it is opened, the counting house feels narrower. For a single breath, the room becomes a place of accounting that reaches distant lives. A clerk smooths the page and begins to read in a careful, even voice. He lists cargo, sugar, casks of rum, bales of cotton, to be gone. And then with the same cadence, he lists people, numbers, ages, sexes, and the brief notations required by customs. The words are official. Consignment, 132. Embarked at Bonny. Condition, stated as fair. Manifests and bills of lading are spare, but each line carries weight. The clerk reads steadily, letting the figures fall into the room with the authority of record. Reading aloud makes the ledger communal. Partners can annotate, argue, and question details as they are spoken. It also collapses distance. Names like Bonny, Cape Coast, and Barbados, places that for most present exist only on an engraved map, become audible and therefore present. The merchant follows each line with his eyes. He listens for a surgeon's note and watches the margin where the ship's master has added a short comment about condition and embarkation. A shout from the quay makes the window rattle. The clerk slows at a line noting a death before shipment. The phrase died before shipment appears in many archival returns. It is legally precise and devastatingly plain. The room holds its breath. The merchant asks who witnessed the death and whether a surgeon signed a certificate. The clerk produces a small return and reads the certification aloud. The document records time, witness, and cause in the dry language of officialness. It will be filed to satisfy customs and insurers. The accounting requires particular items. Age is often recorded in bands such as child, youth, or adult. Origin is stated. Sometimes an insurance value is penciled beside a line. These notations sit oddly in a room where families prepare breakfast and where stained glass proclaims civic charity. The ledger's neutral grammar turns human lives into shorthand, F or M for sex, a numeral or range for age, and a monetary mark for value. Those entries will later be consulted by customs officers, insurers, and historians, trying to reconstruct what the papers conceal and what they reveal. The manifest also includes practical instructions that will govern the voyage, casks of water and beer allotted per person, space in the hold set aside for bedding and provisions, and directions for ballast and for access to air. Surviving sailing instructions show how captains tried to balance speed and health. Greater speed promised shorter exposure to sickness, but increased the risk of capture by privateers. Surgeons were required to keep daily logs of sickness and death. Those logs would later be used in claims, in inquiries, and sometimes in campaigns for reform. Copies of the same manifest travel in several directions. One copy is lodged with customs, another remains in the counting house, and a third is sent by packet to partners in London. Reading here is therefore an act of validation and transmission. What is read aloud will be folded, stamped, and traced through legal channels until it becomes part of an archive. The merchant understands that these words will survive him and be used by others to reconstruct what happened. When the clerk reaches the middle of the list, he slows and the room gathers. The merchant's wife, who has kept mostly to the parlor, passes a hand over her throat and returns to the hearth with a folded cloth. In contemporary letters, some women described attending such readings with unease. They did not dismiss the commerce of their homes, but they experienced its moral gravity differently. A child tugs at the hem of a clerk's coat, unaware of the meaning behind the terms being read, and the clerk briefly softens his tone. That temporary softness does not cancel the ledger's demands. The clerk finishes the roll call and reads a terse note about provisioned water and a short assessment of crew competency. He pauses only once, long enough for the merchant to weigh the risk of a delay against the cost of waiting for fresh provisions. Underwriting premiums are an unspoken thermometer in the room. Each extra day in puerta increases apparent risk, raises freight costs, and may heighten the chance of claims should sickness spread. At the window, an underwriter leans on the sill and listens. Coffee houses turn gossip and reports into policy. For merchants and underwriters alike, news is capital. He mentions a gale reported near the Azores and asks whether the captain will alter course. The merchant produces a scrap of maritime news and the underwriter names a premium. Figures rearrange the scene as if by arithmetic, a sum, a rate, a ledger entry, and the familiar room takes on the quickened logic of an exchange. The reading ends with the captain's assurance of seaworthiness and a short list of ports of call. The paper is refolded with the weight of decisions still to come. Outside, the quay prepares. Tar is pumped, ropes are coiled, and small boats are loaded. Inside, the counting house returns to its quiet work, but the manifest has already moved outward, toward holds and pens, toward the ship where people will soon be crossed by the tide. Decisions are imminent. A single signature will set a chain of events in motion. For the moment, the counting house waits. The underwriter's note arrives like weather, a small folded packet handed across the threshold by a man who smells of pipe smoke and strong coffee. He has been in rooms where news circulates as currency. There is civility to the exchange, an economy of politeness that masks urgency. Inside the counting house, the paper is unsealed, and the words within are read aloud with a steadiness that steadies no one. Marine insurance reshaped Atlantic commerce. Agreements struck in coffee houses and exchange rooms turned singular risk into shared liability. For a Liverpool merchant, the underwriter is both partner and arbiter. He listens to reports of weather, privateers, and sickness. He judges a ship's hull and a captain's past. He sets a premium that will determine whether a venture is sensibly insured or ruinously costly. A raised premium sounds like a small alarm in the room's architecture of balance. The note lists reasons with bureaucratic detachment. Privateer activity spotted to the west. Fresh reports of fever at a coastal depot. Delays in provisioning at Barbados. Read in the counting house, those items stop being abstract and become immediate facts that will press against margins and reputations. The merchant studies the figures as if they were a new kind of weather, something to be read, measured, and reckoned with. Negotiation begins a familiar dance. The underwriter explains his view: the ship's age and maintenance, the captain's record, the season's hazards, prior claims. He asks precise questions. Is the hull coppered to prevent fouling? Are stores stowed according to the surgeon's recommendations? Has the ship been surveyed recently? Copper sheathing, which became common in the late 18th century, reduced hull fouling and shortened passages. Such a detail alters the assessment of seaworthiness, and therefore the premium asked. The merchant answers with papers, receipts for fresh water, a surgeon's certificate attesting to the men's health, the captain's letter describing repairs and readiness. He produces the captain's character in the form of names, men whose reputations functioned as capital. Those stories are partly evidence and partly performance, an appeal to trust as much as to fact. Underwriters listen, make small marks in shorthand, and convert these narratives into numbers. At the heart of the exchange is a question of distribution. Who bears the loss if misfortune comes? Owners, investors, insurers, crew, all shoulder parts of the burden. Underwriters will sometimes accept added clauses. A convoy promise in wartime, stipulations to avoid certain coasts, or requirements for extra provisions. Those clauses reshape the voyage. A diversion to avoid a dangerous coast lengthens the trip. Extra provisions cost space and money. A promise of convoy alters speed and timing. The counting house tightens under the weight of these choices. The merchant knows the arithmetic. A percentage increase in premium reduces profit, partners may bridle, creditors may demand security. But choosing to delay is costly too. Demurrage, the fees for a ship detained beyond agreed lay time, can erase weeks of expected gain. Cargo schedules are tuned to market rhythms. If sugar arrives late into an oversupplied market, prices fall. The ledger is not an abstract instrument, it measures civic life and consequence. Insurance decisions are also social judgments. Terms and refusals are remembered in trading circles. A merchant who repeatedly demands underwriters accept risky ventures may find his name wilt in coffeehouse talk. An underwriter who covers a string of bad losses may find investors reluctant. Reputation flows as surely as capital. In the exchange rooms, men assessed not only ships but each other. Domestic life threads the room as the negotiation proceeds. A maid delivers a parcel of oysters, a child darts in and out, a woman in a quiet dress asks for a small donation for a local almshouse. These moments stitch commerce to household and to civic charity. The same wealth debated here underwrites stained glass and hospital wings. Ledgers can record both convict cargoes and public benefaction. As the underwriter makes his final adjustments, the merchant runs through contingencies. If the premium rises by a certain fraction, which consignments can be postponed? Which partners will share the additional cost? He considers the captain's temperament. Some will push on regardless, others will insist on delay, and the crew's condition. A thin crew raises the risk of mismanagement and disorder at sea. History records desertions and uprisings when voyages were poorly provisioned or mismanaged. For a long moment, the room quiets. The merchant imagines two futures: accepting the premium and pressing the voyage into risk for potential profit, or withdrawing and preserving capital, but risking reputation and missed opportunity. Both choices cost in different currencies. He signs a provisional acceptance, then pauses to reconsider the captain's note recently delivered from the quay. A sailor has returned breathless with fresh word. Trouble recruiting hands. A whisper of smallpox at a holding depot. A privateer sighted a 2 days' sail to the west. The underwriter reads the line and folds his paper with a slower hand. Men who trade risk change their terms when new facts arrive. The counting house's air alters. The merchant meets the underwriter's eye and finds that the decision is no longer solely arithmetic. It is now a negotiation of time, health, and human consequence. Outside the window's rope clanks, a longboat strains at its oars, and the river flashes like a knife. The underwriter names his final condition: a higher premium, a clause for extra provisions, and a stipulation that the captain take on a specified number of hands before cover becomes effective. The merchant nods, signs with a careful flourish, and hands the paper back. It is a small victory, uncertainty converted into conditional safety. But the page signed is also a contract with limits, a promise that will be tested as the vessel leaves the quay. Before the ink has dried, a customs officer appears in the doorway with a stamped warrant that will require inspection. The new demand is procedural and immediate. It holds the power to delay everything. The parlor is arranged to show a life well ordered. Heavy curtains, a chest of polished mahogany, a mantel with a family portrait, and a set of silver displayed behind glass. The light there is warmer than the counting house, softened by drapery and the flicker of a recently cleaned brazier. A servant moves with the careful choreography of a household practiced in ceremony, folding napkins, laying a dish of cold meat, arranging a small bowl of preserved fruit. This room stages respectability. For merchants, the outward signs of respectability were civic currency: a stained glass window in a chapel, a funded schoolroom, a hospital wing bearing a donor's name. These were the visible marks of a family's standing. Many port towns, Liverpool among them, bear plaques and benefactions sponsored by commercial elites. Such acts performed simultaneous functions. They aided the public good, reinforced social bonds, and anchored a private name in public memory. Money pressed into stone and glass made a biography legible. At breakfast, the merchant's wife speaks in gentle, efficient sentences about the almshouse subscription and the plan for the parish sermon. She moves between the domestic and the civic, arranging tea for a visiting clergyman, adjusting a list of names for annual pew rents, and noting which charities require another donation this quarter. Women of merchant families often orchestrated charitable gestures, choosing beneficiaries and overseeing distribution. Their work was practical and public, yet the route to those donations matters. The profits that funded the glass and the hospital wing frequently came from commerce in sugar, rum, and manufactured goods tied to Atlantic exchange. This is an uneasy fact of urban history. The public face of philanthropy and the private origins of capital can be braided together in ways that strain moral imagination. Contemporary critics and reformers, Quakers, evangelical groups, and later abolitionists made this tension visible by compiling testimonies, publishing narratives, and drawing connections between ledgers and lives. Inside the parlor, the merchant negotiates these contradictions with the daily habits of respectability. He signs a receipt for a donation. His wife instructs a servant to prepare parcels for distribution to a charity school. A child practices gratitude in a manner rehearsed by family ritual. The deeds are careful and sincere, but their sincerity does not erase the broader ledger. A ledger kept in the counting house lists consignments whose value underwrote the same philanthropy. Those entries will be consulted by critics and historians who try to reconcile civic benefaction with its sources. Still, the language of civic virtue matters. To be a public benefactor was to be remembered as a man who improved the commonwealth. Names on a hospital wing or a schoolroom ensured a place in city memory that could outlast controversies. For many merchants, this was a strategic investment in the future, a way to bind a family's fortunes and reputations to institutions that would last. The same generosity that filled a hospital bed could also secure a name on a plaque for generations. The parlor also holds private rituals that remind a merchant of his domestic obligations. He writes a brief note to the schoolmaster about a bequest, then pauses to listen to a maid recount a matter at the bakehouse, where a supplier has shorted the order. Small economies of reputation play through the day. Who delivers bread reliably? Which cooper makes an honest barrel? Which clerk can be trusted to file returns? These choices are granular and immediate. They compose the texture of household management. Conversations shift toward moral language as well. A visiting clergyman speaks about stewardship in terms that blend spiritual counsel with civic expectation. Wealth is a trust to be spent for the common good. Such sermons were common and could be profoundly sincere. Yet sermons also reinforced social hierarchies by channeling guilt and prudence into charitable giving rather than systemic change. For many parishioners, the act of giving functioned within an accepted moral order that left broader questions unresolved. The merchant thinks of his children, setting them toward education, connections, apprenticeship. Sending a son to a counting house or a nephew into partnership ensured that family business continued. Endowing a school could provide both moral benefit and a pipeline of obedient clerks. Educational philanthropy therefore served private interest as much as public good. The lines blur. The schoolroom's charity and the counting house's hire are two sides of the same civic coin. A letter arrives with news of a public meeting where the subject of trade and morality is to be discussed. The growing campaigns to regulate or restrain the trade and enslave people are part of the wider public conversation. The merchant reads it with a hand that betrays both anxiety and calculation. He can attend a meeting, speak in defense of commerce, propose reforms that will ease criticism, or keep his name out of the debate and let others shape the public record. Each choice threads into the city's political texture. He folds the letter and tucks it into a private drawer. Domestic display and public virtue have done their work for the morning. The servants are set, the donation signed, the child sent to lessons. Yet the documents remain in the counting house and will be compared later by historians, by critics, by townspeople, against cargo lists and surgeon reports. The folding of a check will be read differently depending on which ledger the reader consults. A distant bell marks the hour. The merchant prepares to leave the parlor. He glances at the portrait above the mantel, an ancestor's gaze immobile in oil, and then at the small model of a ship by the window. He feels the pull of two worlds, the tidy domestic world of polished silver and parish pews, and the rough swald of rope, tar, and hold. One will be on display, the other will be hidden below deck until it is examined in print or in court. Outside, the customs officer's warrant waits, an authority that will test both domestic display and public virtue in the same procedural breath. Clerks are the counting house's invisible machinery, early risers, indexers of debt, keepers of margins. They move with a deliberate economy, quill in hand, ink on cuff, eyes trained to translate lives into columns. One of them, a young man with quick, furtive hands, has begun to keep, beside the official ledgers, a small private book. He does not advertise it. The notebook is a cheap volume, its spine soft from use, and its pages freckled with tea stains. In cramped script, he records names, approximate ages, ports of embarkation, and brief notes that do not appear in the manifest. A line may read, Bonnie, several children, or holding pen, fever present. The manifest reduces people to numbers. His private list insists on particulars. It is a small act of memory. We should be clear. Specific cases of clerks keeping such personal notes are not always preserved, but historians do find marginalia, depositions, and private papers that suggest some employees kept extra records or made notes later used by reformers. Those scraps, when they survive, have helped later generations stitch human detail back onto ledger lines. The young clerk folds his page now and tucks it beneath the ledger, and act equal parts fear and tenderness. He knows the action is small. He also knows that small acts can accumulate into consequence. His rebellion is procedural more than theatrical. He delays a routine signature until a captain fetches an extra cask of water. He annotates a margin with a terse query. Will extra bedding be stowed? And insists the note be recorded. These amendments do not stop voyages. They thicken the paper trail with small protections. If paper can demand better provisioning, then better paper might buy time, space, or sleep for the men below. He acts at the edges of record keeping. From a surgeon's return, he copies a particular entry, dates, witness, cause into a sealed note. He keeps that note aside in case a correspondent who collects testimony should ask for evidence. He is not certain anyone will ask. He is not certain any correspondent could act on such scraps. Still, he preserves the detail. The act is risky. Counting houses prize order. Secrecy is disfavored and can cost a clerk his place. Yet he prefers this risk to the comfortable amnesia of perfectly kept ledgers. Small resistances find quiet allies. An older clerk with years of ink behind him offers practical counsel. Mark the date and witness clearly, he says, as if method were courage. A servant who moves through the room folds the young man's coat so that the notebook's bulge is less visible when inspectors call. These gestures are minor conspiracies of care, household economies and human sympathies that rarely appear in official lists. Resistance also appears in operational practices. Captains and surgeons sometimes, by choice or experience, added extra rations or improved bedding and ventilation. Some masters tightened watch rotations to reduce crowding, and some surgeons experimented with airing and cleanliness within the limits of the ship's holds. Such measures were imperfect and inconsistent, dependent on individual choice and resources, but they were historical realities that could reduce suffering. The clerk's annotations aim to nudge practice as much as paper. The young clerk's marginal notes change how events are witnessed. Where the manifest speaks in categories, he writes human observations. Child called K sobbed at dawn. Old woman spoke of distant home. He believes that a ledger's arithmetic becomes less monstrous when names and voices persist inside paper. For him, the move from rows and totals to specific life traces is an act of conscience. Conscience, however, carries consequences. The merchant's sharp rebuke at a smudged page is not merely about neatness. It is a defense of the official line. Clerks who deviate from forms risk censure, wage reductions, reassignment to worse offices, or dismissal. Counting houses reward obedience and penalize hesitation. The young clerk knows the stakes. He understands that what he does must be measured discreetly if it is to survive. That morning, a stranger arrives at the counting house, a man known in town for attending reform meetings and for printing pamphlets. He asks carefully for information about recent returns and perhaps for testimony. They speak quietly in a corner. The clerk folds his private page into his hand and imagines possibility. Handing the list over could amplify the voices it contains. Handing it over could also expose him and end his employment. He touches the notebook, then slides it back into its hiding place, torn between duty and witness. The conversation finishes with a polite bow and a folded card given to the merchant. The reformer leaves. The card is a small, manageable object, but it carries a weight in the clerk's mind. An invitation, a warning, a map to choices he must soon make. He thinks of his own family, of wages that pay for coats and bread, and of the larger world the counting house writes into being. Outside, the customary noises alter. A cart grinds along the quay. Men shout a time call. The tide moves the ships like a slow clock. Then a heavier sound interrupts, the firm boot of a customs officer mounting the counting house steps. The door opens and a shadow falls across the desk. The room tightens as if measured by a new ruler. The clerk's fingers close around the hidden book, and for the first time he understands that small rebellions invite risk as much as they invite witness. He breathes, counting the small costs of conscience. You step from the counting house and the world changes pitch. Where the room's light had been measured and deliberate, the cry is immediate and loud. Ropes shriek against timbers, a capstan groans under a man's shoulder, and the clink of iron on iron keeps time like a rougher metronome. The river is a long, moving mirror. Barges and hulks crowd its edge, their wet planks sweating salt and pitch. Sound here is layered. Sailors' calls, the bald arithmetic of foremen, the thin music of gulls, and the whole place smells, insistently, of trade. Smells arrive first, the warm, thick sweetness of molasses leaking from imperfect casks, the bitter, resinous tang of tar and pitch, the metallic edge of iron from newly forged chains and anchors, and the damp, animal smell of wet rope and canvas. Beneath those dominant notes there are smaller human scents: sweat, smoke from coal stoves, the sharp citrus of citrus fruit meant to stave off scurvy, and the faint sourness that sometimes accompanies men newly come from crowded holding pens. Contemporary accounts and port records make it clear how these odors layered into daily life at the dock. They are not picturesque, they are functional, telling traders and seamen at a glance where goods have come from and what to expect. Hands move everywhere. Cooperage crews hammer staves into hogsheads. Lightermen squat in small boats, taking soundings and shuttling bundles to larger ships. Longshoremen sling heavy bales and shout precise, abbreviated counts. The language of the quay is economy made vocal. Short calls about weight and destination. Abbreviations that save breath and time. There are also other tongues. The port is a crossroads, and sailors and traders bring dialects and languages with them. For the man who has grown used to the counting house's quiet, this polyglot bustle can feel like a foreign country. On the waterfront, people judge freight by touch and by eye. A cooper taps a cask to test its tone. A mate runs a hand over a bale's stitching. A factoring agent squints at a sugar sample to assess purity. These small, practiced gestures carry years of tacit knowledge and decide the fate of consignments. The same hands that handle sugar and rum also handle paperwork, stamping bills, signing receipts, so that tactile and bureaucratic economies move together in the same hour. At the quay's edge, the apparatus of shipment is visible in its rough truth. Gangplanks, tackle, slings, a long, slippery gangway where men and boys shuttle up and down with parcels and provisions. On some ships, hammocks hang in neat rows aft. Below deck, the dark holds wait with the work of stowage. Contemporary shipboard regulations sometimes required space, bedding, and ventilation for those carried as cargo, though practice varied widely and enforcement was uneven. Surgeons' returns and parliamentary inquiries from the period document both the stipulations and the persistent gaps between law and practice. A small knot of people draws your attention, a factor supervising the movement of a cask, a mate arguing about the order of stowage, a young sailor whose hands are raw from hauling. They speak in clipped business terms. Beneath the words runs another conversation, about timing and money. The same hour that sees casks rolled and bills stamped also sees men bargaining for wages, captains seeking extra hands, and victualling officers demanding provisions. The decisions made here, how many men are signed on, where the last hogshead is stowed, will shape the voyage's speed and the conditions below decks. There are moments of human tenderness caught in the quay's rough choreography. A woman passing with a bundle pauses to hand a small parcel to a seaman bound for a ship. A boy runs ahead to fetch a promised coat. An older sailor pats a younger man's shoulder and speaks a quick word of counsel. These acts are ordinary, local stitches that hold the waterfront community together. They do not erase the harder facts of the commerce being readied. They merely remind us that life at the quay mixed the intimate and the transactional. Tension gathers too. A customs officer moves through the crowd with practiced authority, checking seals and comparing manifests against casks. When a seal is wrong, or a weight does not match the bill of lading, a small argument can swell into delay. Men curse, faces close to one another, and words sharpen. Delays are costly. Demurrage charges rise, a captain's patience thins, and markets adjust. A single inspection note can rearrange profit forecasts. The quay measures these ripples in immediate money and time. At the far edge, near a set of wagons, you catch sight of a string of small pens and erected temporary sheds, holding areas where people and goods awaited transfer. Contemporary port records and eyewitness accounts describe such depots, guarded yards or sheds where those to be embarked were kept before being taken aboard. The pens sit apart from the domestic bustle, fenced and functional, their presence noted like a darker undertow to the rest of the scene. Where men stow casks and weigh sugar is not far from where other human beings wait to be moved. The juxtaposition is an ordinary cruelty of port life. Voices rise when a captain appears, broad, emphatic, commanding attention. He moves quickly, checking ropes, questioning a foreman, nodding at a manifest. The crew responds in immediate work. Lines are shifted, a sail is loosened, a cask is braced differently. In the swirl of activity, a rumor threads through, a whisper of sickness at a holding depot upriver, a sighting of a privateer, a shortage of lime juice in a neighboring port. Rumors travel fast on the quay. Sometimes they are mere wind, sometimes they presage real danger. When they land, they alter moods. Faces harden, plans adjust. You notice the young clerk from the counting house in a doorway, his private notebook tucked beneath his coat. He watches the pens with a tightness at the jaw. The sight of people kept close enough to be counted, but far enough to be unseen presses against him. The smells seem stronger there, the air narrower. He thinks of his marginal notes, of the reformer's card folded into the merchant's drawer, and of what could happen if his small record ever left his hand. A longboat falls into the water with a wet slap. Men haul and the gangway hums under shifting weight. The captain glances toward the counting house, then at the stamped manifest in his hand, and then at the pen where silence seems thicker. The quay, so full of goods and gestures, carries the possibility of delay and the imminence of departure in the same breath. The surgeon comes back wet from the river and smelling faintly of tar and boiled brine. He carries a small leather-covered book in which he has written the day-by-day rhythms of the ship, lists of ailments, times of fever, notes on rations, and a terse record of deaths and recoveries. His handwriting is efficient, the ink often blotted from wet fingers. The pages show the care of someone who must measure bodies as carefully as cargo. Surgeons at sea were a peculiar mixture of medical practice and administrative duty. On many voyages, a surgeon's return, brief, factual, and formally sworn, would be required by insurers and customs. Those returns have survived in archives and provide historians with one of the clearest windows into life aboard. They are composed in a restrained language, dates, symptoms, numbers, numbers, and sometimes brief comments on the state of the men and women held below. The surgeon is both witness and bureaucrat. He lays the book on the counting house table and opens to a passage. The clerk reads aloud. From embarkation to present, total embarked 132. Mortality to date, 6. Cause, putrid fever and dysentery. Observed, overcrowding and limited ventilation in lower hold. The words are measured and cold. Where the manifest once spoke in aggregate, the surgeon's return names processes of death, disease, space, deprivation, with a procedural clarity that is both humane and indifferent. This is the language of claim-making. Insurers and merchants listen to these returns because they determine liability and compensation. A notation about putrid fever or inadequate water can produce claims for compensation or prompt procedural inquiries. Surgeons sometimes included recommendations: extra bedding, increased airing, a reduced stowage density, but enforcement depended on captains and owners. The return carries moral force in paper form. Whether it changes practice is another matter. The merchant runs a finger under a line that notes the number of sick in a particular ward. He calculates quickly in his head. If sickness increases, mortality projections rise. Cargo value may fall if a ship detours to a port to land the sick. Insurance claims may follow. The counting house air tightens as arithmetic condenses human suffering into projections. For many merchants, this is not a philosophical exercise. It is a ledger calculation with immediate financial consequence. The surgeon's voice is restrained but steady. He details the distribution of water, the condition of bedding, and the methods tried to ventilate the hold. Simple measures such as keeping hatches partly ajar during night watches, smearing lime on certain timbers, and shifting the rotation of watches to reduce crowding. These were practical interventions known at the time, sometimes recommended in surgeons' manuals. Surgeons' suggestions could reduce mortality when followed rigorously. They could also be ignored when profit or space dictated otherwise. A younger clerk asks about the distribution of medicines. The surgeon produces a small box of salts, some laudanum, and herbal tinctures, standard kit for the period. He notes that supplies are nearly expended, and that local provision in a nearby depot might be contaminated. The counting house maps the scarcity. Medicines must be bought, stores replenished, and the cost distributed. For the merchant, the calculus is clear. Pay now for greater safety or risk greater loss later. Again, the ledger insists. The surgeon also speaks to the human detail that numbers cannot fully hold. He mentions the names of a few who showed resilience: a woman who nursed a child through fever, a man who insisted on keeping a small carved wooden toy that reminded him of home. These small notes, tucked into an otherwise formal return, are the traces that humanize the ledger. They are the moments scholars cherish for the light they throw on lives otherwise compressed into totals. There is a procedural pause. A customs officer at the door asks to inspect the surgeon's notes and to compare them with the manifest. Legal officers sometimes use such returns to determine whether a voyage complied with regulations on provisioning and space. When a return suggests inadequate conditions, a fuller inquiry might follow. Histories of reform in the period often reference such comparisons, where a surgeon's return opened administrative pathways to claims or to public scrutiny. The merchant confers briefly with the underwriter, whose pencil moves across the margin. The underwriter frowns. Numbers change the risk profile as they are read. He asks whether the ship can put into a nearer port for fresh water and medicine. The captain, who has been arguing the ship's seaworthiness, appears in the doorway and listens. His face is set. Captains often face difficult choices between speed, profit, and the lives aboard. Contemporary records record many such dilemmas, whether to press on to preserve cargo value or to land the sick and risk delay and demurrage. A tense moment follows. A clerk asks plainly whether extra bedding can be stowed, and the captain replies that space is already allotted for ballast and cargo. He suggests the surgeon's recommendations will be followed as far as practicable. The merchant calculates again and consigns a sum from petty cash to buy extra bedding and salts. It is a small amount compared to overall cargo value, but for those below, it will mean a better chance at survival. The surgeon gathers his book and stands. He thanks the merchant in clipped terms and prepares to return to the vessel. The pages close with the sound of cloth on leather. As he steps toward the key, a note is thrust into his hand by the young clerk. The folded page from the clerk's private book. The surgeon's fingers pause on the paper. He opens it, reads a single line, and then looks up with an expression that tightens the room's air. What the surgeon reads will carry the clerk's small act beyond the counting house ledger and into a world of petition and print. It will also test whether private notes can alter public procedure. For a single moment, the counting house holds its breath as paper passes from hidden margin to an official hand. The coffee house is a different kind of counting room, shutters thrown open to the street, the hiss of boiling water, and conversation that moves at the speed of rumor and advantage. Men gather in low chairs around small tables. Newspapers lie folded, and ledgers are balanced with a cooling cup of coffee. Here, news becomes currency and opinion becomes a contract. For merchants, underwriters, captains, and agents, the coffee house is both market and theater. You push through the door and the air hits you. Aroma of roast, tobacco smoke, and the faint metallic tang of coin. Voices thread through the room. A captain recounts a storm. An underwriter names a premium. A merchant counters with figures scraped from a ledger. Coffee houses often served as informal exchanges, places where information condensed into a price, where a rumor in a colonial packet could raise a premium, and where men stitched accounts into the public market's fabric. Today's table is crowded. An underwriter leans forward, fingers stained with ink, and reads the morning's news from the islands. Privateer sightings on the Western Passage, an outbreak at a depot upriver, and a convoy delayed. The items land like pebbles in the room's pool, and the ripples reach listeners in different ways. A printer's quick sheet sits on a corner, one of those penny broadsides that can tilt opinion in a single reading. Negotiation begins as a dialectic of risk. The underwriter names a higher percentage. He justifies it with the sea's present dangers and an actuarial tone. The merchant counters with mitigations, guarantees of extra provisions, a surgeon's endorsement, a decorated captain's prior returns. Each claim is a bid and a pledge, stories converted into contract language that can be reduced to signatures and clauses. Men move arguments into forms. If clause X, then Y. Exclude pre-existing illness. Coverage from. Tone matters. A confident captain's word can substitute for a marginal certificate. A known underwriter's reluctance can signal reputational injury. Men carry reputations like coins, some shiny and new, others clipped and suspect. Coffeehouse talk calibrates those reputations. An offhand aside, he's overstated his tonnage before, can sink a premium. An authoritative endorsement can prompt acceptance. Reputation turns into lines in a ledger. Those lines decide who will sail and who will wait. Bargaining is partly technical, partly performative. Men tap maps and tables of seasonal navigation. Someone cites surgeon's returns that suggest improved provisioning among certain captains. The performance stages competence. Who knows currents? Who took measures to copper a hull? Who managed losses well? These practical details are the substratum of financial trust. A captain may recount a passage shortened by favorable current. An underwriter will weigh that against reports of privateers. Politics threads through the argument. Naval patrols, convoy timetables, and letters of marque affect hazard. A merchant may promise to avoid certain coasts, but a postponed convoy can remove the hoped-for protection. Underwriters watch diplomatic news. A single commission can shift risk overnight. The coffeehouse is where such larger moves are absorbed into personal calculation. Men speak of admiralty notices with the same gravity they reserve for ledgers. Smaller dramas play out too. A young agent attempts to make a name by offering shares in a new ship. A veteran underwriter tests him about prior voyages. And what was the last mortality? The youth fumbles. The old man's eyebrow lifts. It is a crucible where bluff meets experience. The room keeps score. A young man's misstep can cost a career, while a timely endorsement can establish it. Beneath argument lie economies of favor. Men recall debts and discreet courtesies. How a loan 20 years earlier secured a berth, or how a favor on a dock committee smoothed a survey. Reciprocity channels choices and can bend procedure. The coffeehouse underwrites legal instruments with social capital. A nod here, a recalled kindness there, and a line is accepted. A reformist pamphlet lies on a side table, its edges dog-eared. Its presence alters the room's tone. Men glance at it, soften some claims, and make small concessions about provisioning and surgeon recommendations. Public opinion, like wind, adjusts private talk. Some mutter that pamphlets and printed surgeon returns will bring more formal accountability. Then the clerk slips in a note. The recount has cleared the model ship discrepancy, but an upstream deputy reports a suspect case at the depot. The underwriter's pencil halts. The merchant's mouth tightens. Negotiation recalibrates. Premium nudged, clauses tightened, contingency options discussed. Each man repositions offers and expectations. Someone proposes a clause to exclude pre-existing illness. Another insists on a surgeon-attested clearance. Time is not neutral. Coffee houses close at hour's end, tides shift, and ships keep schedules. A delayed endorsement can mean a missed convoy. Minutes count like coin. Decisions must be struck in the coffeehouse's breath or postponed at cost. The pressure compresses as men calculate demurrage, market timing, and crew recruitment. A final offer is tabled. Extra provisions paid by owners, a surgeon's pledge to monitor, and a clause excluding pre-existing illness from coverage. It is a contract built of compromise. The underwriter circles a figure. The merchant signs. Hands shake. The paper folds for the counting house. There is relief, but the deal carries the conditional language of caution. Even as the deal is struck, talk continues. A voice notes reform societies will soon publish surgeon returns in full. The room falls hush. Men who profit from secrecy feel a chill. Those who favor transparency imagine pamphlets and petitions. The coffeehouse works in the moment, but the moment itself bends toward new public life. A bell marks the hour. Men rise, gather coats, and step into the street where the sea's smell greets them. The merchant tucks the signed agreement into his coat, but in the pocket beside it sits the memory of a clerk's private page and the reformer's pamphlet, hidden things that may outlast ink. Outside, the river seems to listen. The morning at the merchant's house begins with a small, precise ceremony. A blessing said by a visiting clergyman, the crossing of a hand over the heads of children, the soft rustle of a prayer book closing. In houses like this, religion and business coexist not as contradiction, but as an intertwined grammar, piety and profit, arranged in parallel rituals. The family's ritual frames the day, while the counting house's paper determines the lives that will be altered beyond the parlor's doors. You watch as the merchant stands by the hearth, palms folded, while the clergyman intones phrases about duty and stewardship. The wife arranges the children at the window. Their faces catch on the light and look out toward the river, toward the ships and their promises. After the blessing, the family moves to a quieter corner, where the merchant opens a small private ledger. The family accounts separate from the counting house books. It records household expenses, charitable gifts, apprenticeship fees, and the small sums that stitch a family into civic life. The private ledger is neat: columns for shoes and schooling, notations for pew rents and hospital donations, a line for sundries. The merchant's handwriting here is softer than in the larger ledgers. His pen slows as if memory finds place in domestic entries. He writes a check for a school bequest, scratches a note to a steward about coats for winter, and sets aside a small sum for a servant's sickness that had recently worried the household. These gestures are part duty, part performance, family care, and the demonstration of civic virtue. Yet the family ledger sits beside papers from the counting house that bear other kinds of marks: manifests, insurance policies, surgeons' returns. The morning's peace is held in delicate tension with facts from the key. A small packet lies folded beneath the private ledger, a receipt from the coffee house, a coded note about shares of the forthcoming voyage. The merchant's hand hovers over it. Domestic obligation and commercial consequence are held in the same palm. A child asks about the voyages, about the ships that swell the river like sleeping beasts. The clergyman offers a measured answer about providence and stewardship. The merchant gives a different answer, softer and evasive, about distant winds and cargoes. Children learn the seam between what is preached and what is practiced. The household practices gratitude, tea poured, thanksgiving, while the counting house practices calculation. Both forms of practice hold reputations in place. A knock at the door releases the household from the prayer's intimacy. A clerk arrives with an urgent note. Customs require an inspection, and a minor discrepancy has appeared in the sugar weights, a miscount that could become costly if allowed to stand. The merchant's face tightens. The private ledger is closed and set aside. He asks the clerk to fetch the manifest and the underwriter's note. The small ceremony recedes as the arithmetic asserts itself. The clerk moves like one who carries two worlds at once. He is service to the household and servant to the ledger. He places the manifest on the family table with the deference of someone delivering news that might unsettle a home. The merchant looks at the figures, then at the family gathered nearby, and for a moment the room holds the tension between nurture and commerce. He signs a small margin note, authorizing an appeal to the customs office, and in the same motion, tucks the family check into a drawer. 2 acts, domestic and mercantile, performed with the same hand. Outside, on the quay, the embargo announced earlier begins to take practical effect. Men reroute labor, packs are shifted to different sheds, and surveyors prepare lists. The merchant's authorized appeal offers a procedural remedy: an inspection, a recount, a possible reallocation of demurrage costs. It is bureaucracy as mitigation, a finely tuned mechanism of apology and correction that binds the private man to public procedure. At noon, the clergyman steps to the door and speaks privately with the merchant for a time. Their voices are low but firm. They speak of duty, of charity, of how best to respond publicly if the reformers press their inquiry. The merchant considers inviting the Reform Society to witness the ship's provisioning, a public gesture that might preempt criticism. Public testimony could reframe the narrative. A visible survey could demonstrate compliance and disarm opponents. Yet public exposure carries risk. If the inspectors find fault, the consequences could be severe. The merchant pens a short reply. He will agree to a voluntary survey of the holds, provided it occurs within a specified hour, and that a representative of the owners is allowed to attend. He asks for the captain's presence and for the surgeon's notes to be available. The letter is brief and strategic. It arranges the choreography of accountability in advance, turning an opponent's request into a controlled display. Then he signs the family ledger once more, this time a private notation guarding public strategy. A maid enters with a parcel, a small model ship the merchant keeps at his study, a gift from a partner who applauded his willingness to be public. The gesture is double-edged. It is both domestic kindness and a public signal that he moves within networks that can affirm him. He places the model by the window where the children play and then returns to the counting house papers, the day's domestic ritual folding back into duty. Outside the house, the river shifts with tide and traffic. The merchant has made a choice that binds his family's reputation to public scrutiny. The voluntary survey will either shore his standing or expose the limits of private remedies. For now, he steps toward his carriage. His hat is set, his expression careful. The house closes behind him, the blessing's words still whispering in the rooms, while the legal and mercantile machinery turns toward the key. A mounted messenger appears at the gate with a second letter, the partner's packet opened in the coffee house. Its contents could alter premiums or call for an immediate change of course. The merchant breaks the seal and reads. The words inside shift the day's arithmetic. The small model ship sits on a side table like a compact confession. A hand-carved hull, carefully painted bulwarks, tiny coils of rope, and miniature blocks that catch the light. Beside it rests an engraved globe, its hemispheres marked with trade winds and named coasts. These objects are both ornaments and tools, teaching aids for sons apprenticed to navigation and tactile scripts of distance for a family whose livelihood depends on long voyages. You stand before them and feel the compressed reach of empire in miniature. The model's deck is detailed enough to show hatches and a tiny capstan. The rigging suggests how a sail might set to the wind. The globe's engraving marks a series of familiar names. Bight of Benin, Windward Coast, Barbados, labels that sound at once exotic and ordinary to those in port towns. Together they make the far visible and the far knowable, an intimacy of distance that counts both routes and markets. In many merchant houses, such visual aids serve didactic purpose. Fathers pointed to coasts and currents to teach younger partners where to stow, where disease tended to cluster, and which seasons favored speed. The objects allowed for an embodied geography. The merchant could move a tiny hand over an island and trace a route, discussing the logic of headlands and channels as if mapping the family's fortunes on wood and brass. The model and globe are pedagogical props that organize memory and expectation. Around them, the room hums with small interactions. A boy practices a knot, hands clumsy and learning. An elderly partner sips ale and gestures to a point on the globe where a storm blew a recent convoy off course. A clerk hovers near the table with a survey in his hand, comparing the ship's stated capacity to the realities of the hold. The conversation is technical and intimate. Talk of hogsheads, of stowage density, of the tiny arithmetic that determines whether bedding fits alongside casks. These particularities govern comfort and survival below decks as surely as they govern profit above. The model offers other intimacies. Someone long ago carved faint initials on the keel, an invisible signature that insists on authorship. The maker may have been a craftsman in the town, a sailor with time ashore, or a child practicing skills. Such traces are common, objects made and gifted that carry private gestures into public rooms. Owners admire the craft and also the symbolic claim it represents, a miniature mastery over the ocean's caprice. The globe's surface bears the marks of hands and habits, a fingertip worn pale over the Azores, a penciled line tracing a favored route, a blot where ink once spilled during a late night of calculation. Objects store use as much as meaning. For merchants, the globe is not merely map, but ledger in a different key. It is a memory that insists on the routes taken, on the places that remunerate, and on the hazards marked in the margins. At the same time, these objects can conceal. The globe's neat engravings do not show the human presence hidden in holds, the noise of chains, the cramped stacking of bodies, or the small deaths recorded in surgeons' returns. The model's ship's deck cannot capture the smell of molasses mixed with despair below. The room's objects make knowledge elegant and teachable, while also obscuring what they cannot represent. This neatness is a form of selective vision, a way to make commerce legible while smoothing its harder seams. A partner leans forward and points to a latitude on the globe where the Gulf Stream can shorten a passage. He speaks of a captain who once used the current to cut weeks from a crossing, and the room nods. Such stories bind practice to legend, turning risk into lore. But such gains were uneven and costly. Faster passages could reduce exposure to disease, but increase the chance of striking a privateer if one moved into contested waters. The model and globe anchor these choices, reminding listeners that seamanship is a negotiation between hazard and reward. Nearby, a small exchange takes place when the clerk places the recent customs tally against the model's measured capacity. There is a tight arithmetic. Casks weigh so much, bedding takes so much space, and ballast must fill a precise void. The calculation is mundane and fierce. It decides whether space remains for extra bedding or whether human presence will be compacted to economize profit. Those ledger sums bend the globe's narrative into immediate consequence. The carving of initials, the faded finger on the Azores, the penciled lines, These private marks become relevant when paper meets port. A miscount, a misstow, a hurried entry in the manifest can change how the object's tidy lessons play out in reality. The model's neat proportions do not always match the hold's messy necessities. That mismatch, when exposed, becomes an argument in the offices of custom, insurance, and law. A knock at the door interrupts the room's mediation. A custom surveyor enters with a stamped warrant and a list of questions. He asks to inspect the model ship's recorded capacity against the ship's actual stowage. He requests to see the surgeon's notes and the captain's recent survey. The merchant's hand tightens on the globe, as if the map's brass could steady his nerves. The objects that taught distance now preside over an inquiry that will determine permission to sail. The surveyor's questions are precise and procedural. He measures the model's indicated hold and compares it to the manifest's declared tonnage. The clerk reads aloud the return numbers. A small discrepancy appears. A set of casks recorded to fit the forward hold seem also to be assigned additionally to the aft, creating a tension that could be interpreted as an error or a deliberate miscount. The merchant answers carefully, speaking of last-minute rearrangements to preserve cargo balance. His voice is measured and careful, familiar tactics offered in a practiced register. The surveyor frowns and notes the inconsistency. The request is simple: an immediate recount of the hold and a sworn statement from the captain and the master cooper. Such a recount may take hours and risk demurrage or further delay. It may also expose whether the ship's arrangements complied with the written orders for provisioning and space. The model and globe, which once offered learning and control, now stand as silent witnesses to an unresolved accounting. You watch the merchant set the small model carefully back on its stand. The globe's seam catches the light. The surveyor's pen writes across a page, and the merchant's partners exchange looks that are part calculation and part prayer. The small carved initials on the model's keel seem suddenly like a private signature lodged in a public moment. The captain's stool is empty at the key office. A low, scarred seat smelling of tar and tobacco. In its place lie letters, packets tied in twine, a sealed log, and a bundle stamped by island agents. Captains wrote constantly, reports to owners, entreaties to underwriters, terse updates for partners. Their words traveled by packet and carried each voyage's small contingencies. Today those words carry absence. The captain who should be present is delayed. Reports say illness ashore, shortage of hands, or negotiations elsewhere. The counting house already contains traces. A note about recent desertions, a mate's shore report, and a municipal notice about complaints of smallpox at a holding depot upriver. Truth rarely fits one cause. Recruitment shortfalls, competing offers, and outbreaks often arrive together. Letters are read aloud with the same economy found in manifests. One begins with the captain's grievance. Men come slow, 3 have quit. Smallpox at depot. And he follows with a practical plea. Funds to induce recruits, advances, or authority to hire a temporary master. Captains functioned as managers and negotiators. Their letters were both report and entreaty. Owners and underwriters treated them as evidence in which seamanship and necessity met commerce. Another packet brings market news from the islands. Storm damage, a dip in sugar quality, and advice to hasten to market. That counsel tugs against the captain's caution. Markets reward speed, but health and crew readiness govern survival. The counting house feels the tug. Delay preserves life but risks price decline. Haste preserves market share but increases hazards. Embedded in the captain's handwriting are small human traces. He appends a postscript, "If half crew I will not sail," a terse warning that a partially crewed vessel is a danger to order and to lives both afloat and below decks. Such lines carried weight. A captain refusing to sail without adequate hands could stall a venture, but pressing on with a thin crew could invite longer crossings, higher mortality, and disorder. Owners read these notes as forecasts and claims on judgment. Recruitment practices complicate the scene. Sailors were found via tavern networks, newspaper adverts, and sometimes coercion. Bounties and advances helped. The counting house holds a pasted advert. Wanted. Able seamen, good wages, apply, blue anchor. The merchant debates raising the bounty. A larger premium secures hands but cuts profit. A lower bounty risks desertion and mismanagement. This is a ledgered moral, what price reliability? An absent captain reshapes command. If he cannot take the helm, letters of attorney must appoint a temporary master or elevate the first mate. Such delegations are entered in the ship's log and noted for insurers and customs. The merchant weighs whether to authorize delegation now or insist on the captain's return. Delegation preserves motion, it can invite controversy and affect claims if loss occurs. The letters sometimes carry legal consequence. Surgeons' returns, captains' dispatches, and owners' replies could later become evidence in claims, in coroner's inquests, or in parliamentary inquiries. Historians have used such correspondence to track decisions and accountability. For the men who sign these papers now, the awareness that ink may outlast them hovers at the edge of each choice. Paper bears human detail too. A small envelope contains a note from the captain's wife. Delivered quietly by a neighbor, it reads less as commerce and more as plea, an appeal for a small domestic promise to be kept on return. The room pauses. The letter reminds the men that absence threads beyond operational delay. Wives and children bear consequences in ledgers of their own. The merchant folds that note into the packet, pens a brisk reply to the underwriter, authorizes a second advert, and instructs that petty cash be carried to a tavern to secure immediate recruits. He scribbles a provisional delegation form, blank for the captain's signature should he arrive, and a note to the mate to prepare a sworn inventory for the forthcoming recount. Paper becomes action, and action moves the day forward. Still, it is partial. The customs survey remains unresolved, the model ship discrepancy unaccounted for, and the surgeon's recommendation for extra bedding awaits execution. The merchant dispatches hands to the key, posts the advert, and seals coin into envelopes. The counting house's engine spins, decisions parceled, men sent, lists posted. Outside, the key churns. A cooper tightens a cask. A steward hurries with blankets. A boy runs with news of another deserter. Each small motion absorbs the captain's absence into forward work. The merchant's signature inks the forms, binding domestic petition, market pressure, and maritime discipline into one bundle. As noon ticks toward afternoon, a mate arrives breathless with a skiff's latest. An ink-smudged line from the captain himself, delivered not by packet, but by a hurried messenger. The merchant breaks the seal with careful fingers. The page speaks of a choice the captain has already made elsewhere: repair at a nearby port or attempt the voyage with a hastily patched crew. The words will shift the day's arithmetic in a way no ledger yet predicts. He inhales, tasting tar and ink. He steadies his hand and sets his signature, a small act that will send men, money, and judgment outward. Outside, the tide turns and the first rope is loosed. A rumor passed faster than official dispatches. An allegation that a partner had shorted a consignment, that casks were lighter than their marks, or that a steward had taken coin meant for victuals. In port towns, such charges could bloom into scandal. Liverpool's mercantile world was tightly networked. Gossip in a coffeehouse or a whisper at the quay could ripple through partnerships, underwriters, and parish circles. Reputation here was brittle and precious. Scandals often rested on ordinary slippage, errors in counting, ambiguous handwriting, or an opportunistic cooper. But they could also point to deliberate deception, false entries in manifests, or the misallocation of stores that left people short. Contemporary court records and provincial broadsheets show how disputes over weights and missing casks could prompt formal inquiries and public shame. These lightweight pamphlets then swelled rumor into a public narrative. The counting house received the rumor as a folded note and a partner's terse message. The merchant convened partners in the back room, where maps lay folded and tobacco smoke hung low. The mood shifted into accusation and defense. Who packed the casks? Who signed the weights? Had the cooper's ledger been altered? The partners paced, fingers tracing numbers. The air tasted faintly of tar and ink. Small contingencies, wind on the scale, a misread tally, entered the record as explanation or excuse, and each excuse was tested against receipts and witness memory. Partners exchanged receipts and affidavits. A mate delivered a sworn account. Casks weighed on a temporary dockside scale. A gust shifted the balance during measurement. Lawyers, if consulted, would later construe such contingencies as mitigating or culpable depending on advantage. The local press caught wind. A provincial sheet printed a careful, insinuating column that linked commercial irregularity to civic trust. Donor plaques and hospital wings suddenly felt vulnerable to reinterpretation. Ledgers made public could change how benefaction was read. Procedural remedies were set in motion. The merchant requested a formal survey. Neutral inspectors arrived with rods and scales and began recounting casks and examining seals. Such surveys are historically attested, means to restore confidence, An impartial tally could settle the matter, yet surveys themselves consume time. Neutrality is a ritual built out of measurement. It required witnesses, sworn statements, and careful notation. The merchant offered a small bond to guarantee payment should the discrepancy be verified, a practical step that nevertheless suggested possible fault. Practical consequences arrived with the survey. Surveyors' work slowed victualling, stores meant for the voyage sat folded on the wharf while accounts were reconciled. Captains fretted about demurrage, fees levied for delay, and warned that a ship held too long would lose market timing in London or Barbados. Crew tempers frayed, men threatened desertion after repeated recounts. For those held in pens, delays meant diminished rations and extended exposure to cramped, unhealthy conditions. The counting house's procedural dispute thus translated quickly into human cost. The young clerk felt the scandal's pressure in a new register. His private marginalia, notes about holding pens and the condition of the sick, could be subpoenaed or used as evidence. He had intended his book as memory. Now it might be read in depositions or printed in a pamphlet. The moral weight of witnessing, once intimate, had been turned toward public procedure and liability. He kept his hands in his pockets and watched the surveyors count. The affair threaded outward. Partners in London interpreted reports as risk signals. Island agents recalculated harvest expectations. Underwriters in coffeehouse rooms adjusted premiums. A delayed cargo could miss a lucrative market window and depress prices. A whiff of impropriety could cause insurers to demand higher collateral on future voyages. Financial effects moved fast across networks. Money and reputation folded together in one ledger of consequence. Public scrutiny sometimes hardened into formal inquiry. A complaint might be lodged with magistrates, depositions taken, and witnesses cross-examined under oath. Even absent prosecutions, the stain of rumor lingered in pews and coffeehouses. Was he honest? People asked in low voices. Civic memory accrues such questions. Donor plaques later read differently when ledgers are unearthed and linked to contested consignments. At the quay, the recount finished. Surveyors signed a tally matching the manifest. Relief moved through the counting house like a tide receding. Yet prints and pamphlets had already struck. A penny sheet declared the reconciliation unsatisfactory and called for wider reform, clearer measures, statutory penalties for false entries, and independent inspection. Reformers took a small count and turned it into a programmatic demand for structural change. The merchant folded a slip from a London partner, instructing prudence. The slip reminded him that local scuffles are not local in consequence. Administrative checks in one port could alter underwriters' appetites, dissolve partnerships, and reframe a family's civic standing. Quiet accounting habits, once private, produced histories that outlived the men who kept them. A few months later, similar incidents would be cited in reform debates that sought standardized inspection and clearer liability. The merchant recognized that the counting house's small quarrel might seed broader change. Outside, a wagon creaked away with the last recounted casks. A boy ran after it and fell. Women at the quay bent to help him. For them, the counting house's scandal was immediate. Another delay and a hard day. But in print and in coffeehouse rumor, the affair swelled. Public memory had already begun to reframe a morning's arithmetic as a symptom rather than a singular mistake. The merchant watched the pamphlet seller tear off another sheet and understood that this morning's dispute might not close with a signature. Dawn arrives with a thin, pale insistence that flattens the key into a single ribbon of activity. The day of clearance is a ritual of paper and presence. Inspectors in sober coats, clerks with ink-stained fingers, a captain who moves between stern duty and public accountability, and a string of small, practical acts that will determine whether a ship may leave the harbor or be held another week. For merchants, the morning reads like a judgment that will be rendered in stamps and signatures. The customs officers assemble early, their boots clacking on the planks. They carry measuring rods, stamps, and bound forms that will be inked and folded into official packets. A port surgeon waits with a small retinue to compare his return with the manifest. He has already walked to the gangways and has a list of questions. A surveyor squints at the ship's hull and at the manifest's tonnage. Clerks set out copies of the papers, bills of lading, receipts for tariffs paid, the underwriter's conditional acceptance, the captain's attestations, and the surgeon's log. The documents are placed like instruments on a table, and everyone knows which will be read first. There is a procedural order. The customs official reads the manifest aloud and then compares marks on casks with numbers on the bill of lading. A cooper is asked to tap barrels in sequence while a surveyor notes the sound. A clerk produces the weight tickets. Another shows a packed tala where every hogshead is accounted for. Ports sought standard methods, seals to be intact, signatures to match, weights to agree. Where there is discrepancy, a reprieve may be offered for recounting. Where there is conformity, a stamp will grant clearance. The atmosphere alternates between the efficient and the theatrical. At one moment there is the quiet, concentrated calculation of men reconciling columns. The next, a raised voice as two witnesses argue whether a seal was broken before arrival. Onlookers gather, dockhands, shopkeepers, women with parcels, and boys who know the patterns of such mornings. The key is both workplace and stage. Every decision plays out with witnesses who can later testify if required. Bills of health and surgeons' returns sit at the center of the day. A bill of health, issued by the port authorities of the last port of call or by an examining surgeon, signals whether a ship is free of contagious disease. It is not a guarantee. It is a procedural verdict that affects whether a harbor will accept or detain a vessel. In this morning's stack, the surgeon's return is compared line by line to the manifest. Where numbers of sick match the recorded space for bedding, questions soften. Where they diverge, suspicion sharpens. Inspection is tactile as well as textual. Men climb the gangway and down through the hatch into the lower hold, bringing lamps and measured rods. The air changes below deck, cooler, close, full of the mixed scents of fur, damp wood, and stowed goods. The surveyor runs his hand along a plank and taps. Bedding is lifted and measured. A steward produces a sample of water from a cask. The practicalities of ventilation and stowage, how hatches fit, how airways are kept, matter here in a way they do not in parlor conversation. A minor discrepancy emerges. A small set of casks appears double-counted in two sections of the manifest. The clerk who recorded the earlier tally explains it as a last-minute rearrangement to balance cargo amid a shifting wind, but the customs officer notes the irregularity and requests immediate recount. That recount requires men to roll casks, to lift lids where seals allow, and to restate weights. Each lift makes the morning longer and pushes the arithmetic of demurrage forward by the hour. Demurrage is the invisible thread of the day. Every hour a ship sits beyond its laytime accrues fees that eat into profit and sour partnerships. Captains count time with the same care they count courses. Owners feel it in private ledgers. Underwriters calculate whether a delayed ship is still economically viable. The counting house balances the risk of delay against the risk of sailing with unresolved irregularities. The choice is never purely moral or purely commercial. It is a negotiation between law and livelihood. Voices rise at one point when a reformer, having arrived with a small, carefully worded petition, asks to observe the survey. Public observers had begun to appear more frequently in ports where scrutiny of provisioning and space had become a civic issue. The merchant consents to an observer on condition that they remain respectful and that the inspectors conduct the recount. The moment is symbolic. Procedure opens slightly to public view, a tentative concession that public opinion now carries a kind of procedural power. As the recount completes, the customs stamp moves closer to the manifest. A clerk runs his finger down a column and nods. The surveyor signs a line. The captain produces a final attestation about the crew's readiness. The underwriter marks a small note that coverage now takes effect at the moment of clearance, conditional on a last check of the surgeon's kit and the provisioning list. For a breath, the room seems to breathe together toward permission. Yet the morning's rhythm is not linear. A messenger arrives from an upstream holding depot with an ambiguous note. A watchman observed a case of fever among recently embarked people. The note is terse and not fully certified. It is the kind of report that must be verified. Custom practice varied. Some ports insisted on immediate quarantine until a surgeon could attest. Others permitted departure with a clause in the log noting the case. If verified, the presence of fever could force the ship to be detained, produce a localized quarantine, or require landing the sick before departure. The merchant stands still as the paper changes the tenor of approval. For a merchant, the note converts a procedural victory into conditional uncertainty. For the crew, it threatens delay. For those aboard it, means yet another hour in crowded quarters. The surveyor frowns and asks that the ship's surgeon be summoned for a re-inspection. The underwriter withdraws his hand from the pen until the new check is complete. The counting house, which had been moving towards stamped clearance, now re-enters a waiting that is administrative but consequential. Outside, the tide moves as if unconcerned. Dockhands wheel barrels past. Boys shout about midday meals, and the city continues its outward functions. Bread bought, coals fetched, parcels sent. But inside the circle of ink and stamp, decision tightens. The next act, whether the surgeon will confirm the note, whether a quarantine will be ordered, whether the underwriter will reassert a higher premium, will decide whether ropes will be cast off that very day. The hour before departure takes the shape of concentrated motion. Men tighten to the rhythm of hoists and pulleys, the creak of capstan, the short, precise orders that turn human labor into geometry. Below decks, the hold is a layered world. Rows of hogsheads, tarred lines of canvas, narrow aisles where bedding is jammed beside casks. Above, on deck and quay, chains rattle, anchors are triced, and the last parcels are shifted into place. The practical work reads like a liturgy of material. A cooper's mallet taps a cask to test the stave's integrity, a sailmaker's needle runs through heavy canvas, and a mate measures a rope splice by eye. Each action is small and exacting, a set of technical rhythms honed by years at sea. Hands are the instruments. The men who use them know how much a poorly bunged hogshead or a frayed shroud can cost in both money and life. Shackles and chains are part of this morning's choreography too. Steel gear used to secure cargo, anchors, and, in the darker registers of port life, people. Contemporary sources document the presence of manacles and irons aboard many slaving voyages. Surgeons' returns, port records, and inventories sometimes list such items as part of the ship's fittings. Mentioning them explicitly is to face a practical detail that was part of the equipment of a voyage, not a flourish. The counting house records list them among the ship's standard fittings and inventory. A steward checks the latches and the seals. The seals on certain chests are intact. A few small seals have been replaced and noted in the recount. The seal, a wax impression with a merchant's or agent's mark, functions as a guarantee of integrity. Broken or replaced seals require explanation, and, if the explanation is unsatisfactory, can hold a cargo in port. The surveyor removes a seal on one crate and finds the contents as declared. A small release of tension follows in the room. Provisions are the other obsession of the hour. Casks of water are swung aboard in careful rotation. Barrels of salted meat and tubs of lime are counted and countersigned. The surgeon's man checks the store's inventory against his book. Foodstuffs, medicines, bedding, and quantities of water per head. Period guidance documents and surgeon's manuals of the era often specify minimum rations and the need for fresh water calculation. Compliance with those standards materially affected health outcomes and inspections and provisioning decisions. The crew signs on with ink and oath, some by the hand and some by mark. Wages are promised, advance bounties dispersed. In several recorded cases, captains offered extra bounty the last night before sailing to secure men reluctant to sign on. The counting house pays the coin, and men, whose livelihoods depended on immediate need and future promise, accept what is offered. These are hard bargains in a world of overlapping scarcity. A last-minute inspection of the lower hold produces a small, alarming finding. A child, part of the crowded human contingent in a holding pen, shows pallor and a low heat despite the surgeon's earlier check. Not all such moments indicate contagion. Children were often weakened by travel, exposure, and fatigue. The surgeon kneels, takes the child's pulse with a practiced, unsentimental efficiency, and listens to shallow breathing. He records the symptom in his book, in a neat hand, and looks up at the merchant, his face composed. The presence of an ill child produces immediate administrative choice. A port could insist on quarantine until a surgeon certified the illness non-contagious. An owner could press for immediate departure with the child to be tended at the first friendly port. An underwriter could demand that coverage exclude illness existing prior to clearance. Each path carries legal, financial, and human consequences. The captain argues for departure, markets wait. Delay means demurrage and possible spoilage of delicate goods. A quick passage might even reduce exposure to disease by shortening time at sea. The surgeon urges caution. The child's symptoms could presage something contagious. The underwriter, reached by a quick servant with a note, stipulates a clause. Coverage remains conditional. If the surgeon certifies non-contagion this hour, the policy stands. If not, coverage retracts and owners assume full risk. Time compresses. Men roll a fresh cask of water closer to the hatch. A steward fetches a blanket. A clerk prepares a short affidavit noting the child's condition at clearance. The merchant counts in his head the extra hours of demurrage and the ripple into partners' shares. The clap of hammer and thud of rope continue outside, indifferent to the human calculus within. At the stern, the captain paces. He is a man whose judgments steer not only a vessel, but the fortunes of families ashore and afloat. He weighs the market's appetite against a child's breath. In the end, he calls for a compromise. A temporary hold of 1 hour, a more intensive inspection by the surgeon, and a formal notation in the log describing the case and the agreed contingency. It is not a moral absolution, it is a procedural palliative, a way to render the risk legible on paper. The surgeon begins his second inspection, this time more thorough, a search of the child's bedding, a quick question about the child's origin, and whispered consultation with a mate who remembers a similar case from a prior voyage. The hold smell, tar, molasses, and the faint sourness of damp mattresses seems for a breath to thicken. Outside, a bell tolls a time that could convert caution into loss. The hour will decide whether ropes are cast off before dusk or whether the harbor holds them another day. The counting house waits on the surgeon's pen. The merchant watches, ledger open like a patient hand. Night arrives like a slow shutter pulled over the quay. Lamps flare, oil glints behind glass, and the city's edges blur into a chain of points. The river takes the glow and stretches it into a moving smear, lamp to ripple, ripple to black. The Mersey carries the reflected lights away, and the harbor seems to exhale as ropes begin to strain. The work of departure tightens to a small number of ritual moves. Mooring lines are cast, caps are loosened, and the capstan's slow, clacking cadence becomes the vessel's new pulse. Men lean into the rhythm, forearms braced, knees bent, and the ship answers with a low, living creak. The smell of tar and wet oak rises where the tide breathes against the hull. The air brings salt, smoke, and that mercantile scent, molasses, iron, and the oil of a city that lives by trade. On deck, the captain moves with the authority of someone who reads constellations in rope and wind. He checks hatches, looks aft to the wheel, and counts the men signed on. The mate calls roll. The surgeon stands ready with a small satchel of medicines and a ledger close at hand. A steward tightens a last strap on a bundle of bedding. Below, in the dark, the hold contains its human cargo, bodies stacked by necessity and law, bedding trussed into narrow aisles, the air warmed and crowded, and, years of testimony show, dangerously close to what surgeons feared when returns recorded fever and dysentery. From the quay, the merchant watches with the hybrid feelings of a man both near and far. The counting house's documents of the morning, surgeon's return, manifest, underwriter's note, stamped clearance, are folded into a neat packet in his coat. He has done what procedures and reputation could demand, petitioned, consented to a recount, funded extra bedding, and accepted an underwriter's conditional clause. Yet the paper does not measure the sound of a child's breathing or the way a woman steadies another's head below. Paper is precise where feeling is diffuse. A small cluster of family and friends stands on the quay. Wives and children hold kerchiefs, merchants' partners clasp gloved hands. A few men speak in low voices of finish and fortune. There is also a shadowed figure with a printed pamphlet, an observer who had insisted on attending the recount earlier that day. He watches with a guarded expression, one hand in his pocket on a folded note. Public scrutiny and private interest have come to share a pier. The ship loosens its last tie. Blocks creak, and a long rope is eased until the hull nudges outward. Lighter men in a skiff tend a spring line. One man punishes the row with quick strokes so the brig will ride clear. The pilot, a figure smaller than the city's charts would suggest, leans to his oar and guides the channel by eye and muscle. Navigation here is local craft made precise. Slip the ebb, respect the bank, hold to the steerage way. The vessel slips free from the known geometry of quay and warehouse and becomes an object moving through a large, indifferent water. As the ship swings its bow and rides the river, the quay's noises peel off. Shouting fades, footsteps recede, and the city's lamps blur into a single luminous band. The river swallows the harbor lights, and the vessel answers with its own sound. A low chant of work, the shuffling of men, a stray song from a throat used to long hours. Sailors sing sometimes to mark time and to steady nerves. The same voices that haul a rope can carry a melody to ease the body into monotony. Those songs have been recorded in sea journals and port lore, snatches of work song and prayer braided into the movement of a crew. For those aboard, night can feel like both exposure and concealment. The hull flexes underfoot. The beams are familiar and intimate, and also an enclosing architecture. The hold's air circulates by narrow shafts, by hatch lids, and by the judgments of watchmen tasked with keeping breathing room and staving off suffocation. Surgeons paced those spaces and wrote, and some of their returns survive as testimony of what the dark could contain. Small acts of care, quick dressings, quiet dying unnoticed by the city's bright life above. The merchant watches until the outline of the brig becomes a dark cut against the river's smear. He feels the tug of two certainties, the ledger's numbers and the body's presence he can't fully see. He thinks of the clerk and the private book tucked into a drawer earlier that morning, a list of particulars that might one day be read by someone not of the counting house. He thinks of the surgeon who took that folded page and of the quiet expression that followed. The act of witnessing has already begun to rematerialize the anonymous lines into hints of persons. A boy runs with a parcel to hand to a sailor who leans down at the rail. For the man who receives it, the parcel is ballast against homesickness. A scrap of bread, a knitted sock, perhaps a small carved toy. Such exchanges, private and tender, thread through the Voyage's rough geometry. They are not erasures of systemic violence. They are human gestures lodged in a larger machinery. As the ship turns into the wider Mersey, the city's silhouette slides past. A spire here, a factory chimney there, windows glinting like distant eyes. The lights, so bright at the quay, streak off into darkness. Men on deck squint at the compass and at the stars that will guide them across longer dark. The pilot points a finger at the channels he knows by memory. The mate adjusts a sail and the brig gives a small, obedient list. For a brief hour, the world beyond the harbor is a theater of negotiation made of tide and weather. Decisions accumulate, whether to make for the open ocean at the next ebb, to fetch a convoy, or to stand a course that might risk privateers. These are the questions captains and owners have argued over at breakfast and at afternoon meetings. Now they are enacted in motion. Back on the quay, the merchant turns away slowly. He has recorded the necessary marks. He has folded the petitions and receipts into a private file. He is careful in his gait, neither triumphant nor defeated, and he speaks to his wife in words low enough not to carry to the river. The city resumes its business. Lights shaded, ovens fed, ledgers closed for the night. The counting house will reopen, the clerk will resume his marginal book, and the reformer will fold his pamphlets and watch the morning papers that might mention the day's recount. Out on the river, as the brig slides under a dark sky, the surgeon makes his rounds once more. A lantern swings near a hatch and the sound of a measured footfall crosses the deck. The instrument of care moves through a world of commerce and constraint, of practical remedy and limited means. For a moment, the river seems to hold both the light and the dark in its long, moving palm. And yet neither lamp nor ledger can finally tell what the night will carry: weather, enemy sail, sickness, or safe passage to a market that will turn sugar into coin and coin into windows and plaques. The Voyage, having left the pier, now enters the ledger's long tail, where time itself will test every calculation. The counting house closes its books, and the city keeps its lights burning, but the morning's records do not sleep. Ledgers travel through time, folded into attics, consulted in courts, cited by reformers who collected surgeons' returns and eyewitness testimony, and later read by historians who stitch margin and manifest into human story. Paper is stubborn. Its traces outlast the theater of a morning and the men whose signatures weigh a ledger. That persistence is the beginning of legacy. In years that follow such voyages, the paper trail becomes evidence in multiple registers. Surgeons' returns and manifests are used in insurance claims, in depositions, and crucially in public campaigns demanding reform. Abolitionists and humanitarian societies compiled testimony, first-person narratives, surgeons' accounts, and shipping records, to demonstrate the human costs those cold columns only suggest. Numbers married to particulars produced political pressure and legal scrutiny. They helped turn private practice into public argument. At the same time, the city's surfaces remember differently. Brick facades, hospital wings, and stained glass windows bear donor names whose fortunes owed much to Atlantic exchange. Plaques and benefactions offer a public story of patronage. Schoolrooms opened, infirmaries built, aesthetic contributions that promise civic improvement. These visible markers matter and deserve to be read. They also prompt later generations to ask uncomfortable questions about origins and consequence. In coffeehouses and parish rooms, those questions will shape conversation for decades. Private gestures complicate public impression. A child receives schooling funded by the same money that paid for sugar and ship rigging. A hospital bed bears a donor's name. For townspeople, the immediate effects of philanthropy are real and often life-saving. But ledgers later allow readers to connect benefaction to commerce and to ask how public good was bought and at what cost. Such questions will animate pamphlets and sermons, petitions and replies. Sometimes small acts of attention make a difference. A clerk's marginal notebook, tucked beneath a ledger, might be used in a petition or a printed testimony. A surgeon's extra line about an exhausted child can be cited in a claim and in a parish discussion. These fragments, when rescued from trunks and attics, can alter public procedure and public conscience. Paper that seemed private becomes a resource for accountability. Memory is selective. Official records preserve what commerce measures. Other traces, oral accounts, parish minutes, a donated object, fill gaps. Museums, archives, and local presses gather fragments that allow later readers to reconstruct scenes and to question past choices. Where paper is silent, objects can speak. A child's carved toy, a model ship, a stained pane of glass all carry stubborn testimonies. The tactile and the textual together offer a fuller, if still partial, picture. Over decades, civic narratives shift. Legal reforms alter frameworks. Public debate reframes what is acceptable commerce. Some families maintain civic honors. Others see reputations re-examined in print and parish halls. Historians and activists will later sift through surgeons' returns and manifests to argue about policy, memory, and responsibility. Archives become battlegrounds for meaning, as much as repositories for fact. What is preserved and what is displayed shapes how communities imagine themselves. Yet legacy is not only contested record, it is human. The small acts recorded in surgeons' notes, the extra blanket, a cup of broth, a carved toy held in a child's hand, persist as gestures that complicate simpler narratives. People acted within constraints, sometimes protective, often inadequate. Acknowledging such complexity does not excuse harm. It enlarges moral sight and makes responsibility more precise. It asks the later reader to hold both the ledger and the life. For the merchant's family, the mourning folds into a longer life of ledgers balanced, benefactions recorded, and reputations negotiated. For the clerk who kept a private book, that small act of memory might seed reform or appear in a courtroom. It shows how attentive record-keeping can alter public procedure. For the surgeon, his pen remains a modest moral instrument. For the captain, the night's decisions will be counted for years in partners' ledgers and in post-voyage inquiries. Each role leaves traces that future hands will examine. When you pass a hospital wing, a parish plaque, or a row of Georgian houses, you see surfaces shaped by commerce. If you look closer, into archives, into surgeons' returns, into folded margins, you may find another story. The ledger lines that count cargo, the marginal notes that name persons, and the small, stubborn objects that bear witness. Reading memory honestly requires patience, a willingness to hold contradiction, and the courage to ask difficult questions about public virtue and private means. The counting house's papers do not vanish. They will be read in newspapers, quoted in petitions, taught in classrooms, and protested in parish rooms. They show how goods crossed oceans and how choices were made in rooms like the counting house and in parlors. That understanding can do two things: explain the mechanics of commerce and remember the human costs often accompanying economic gain. Night falls on the quay for a final time in this story. The ledger rests closed, but paper, once written, travels further than the hand that wrote it. It invites later hands to read, to question, and to decide how a community will remember. A carved toy sits in some trunk or museum case and waits for a future gaze that will decide what the object tells.